It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Not okay.
Hello again. This is Paul, and welcome to 10 Times the Terror. Today I want to talk about Val Lewton, who made an impressive series of horror films back in the 1940s, and they were very influential. What made Lewton especially important was he took the position that what you don't see is more scary than what you do see. So he's called a master of shadows, and he made 9 films for RKO Radio, who were not a huge studio, but each one of them is memorable, and several of them are really outstanding, are classics. The first one was Cat People, about a young woman who claims to have been cursed by cat worshippers, idolaters back in Europe, and she fears that she can turn into a giant panther and kill anyone that initiates any kind of lovemaking with her, even kissing her. So we have this strange position where she's married to this man. Simone Simon plays the woman. She's a French actress, and Ken Smith is the boyfriend husband. And they're in this odd situation where they're living essentially just like brother and sister, because she's so afraid that any passion that gets unleashed is going to lead her into some kind of murderous transformation into not just an ordinary cat, but some kind of a panther, a deadly cat. It has some similarities to The Wolfman, which was made just a year before. And you have this same question about, is this all in the person's mind? Have they just made this up somehow? And of course, there's a lot of characters in both films who are saying, "Oh no, this can't possibly be real. You're just imagining it." Well, as the viewer suspects and ultimately realizes, it's all too real. And that happens in the case here with Cat People, a psychiatrist who's been sent to try to help this young woman starts having designs on her, tries to kiss her, at which point she turns into a Black Panther and kills him, and then is finally struck by a car afterward. It's a very moody, very kind of strange, dark film. In many ways, I think it's quite superior to The Wolfman, which is a little more direct and overt and upfront. The idea being there's a curse, you get bitten by a wolf, you become a wolf when the full moon comes up. Even a person who is pure in heart and says their prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright, and all that kind of thing. Here, it's this repressed sexuality or something else. But the fact that what triggers the cat monster, if you will, the cat person and Cat People, is not some simple thing like the moon is up. It's the sense of passion, that if her passions or even her sexual urges get aroused, she becomes this deadly Black Panther. Now, this was probably pretty heady stuff back in 1942 when it was released, but some people must have picked up on the idea of the sexual repression and some of these other kind of themes that are there. This is what makes Val Lewton's films so interesting. They're multidimensional. There was then a film called Curse of the Cat People, which would seem to be a sequel, and it is a kind of sequel, but it's an even more unusual film. It's really a film about childhood, and it's about a little girl who feels alone. And the cat woman of the previous film shows up as kind of a dream figure that's like an imaginary playmate for her. And her father is the former husband of this cat person. But the film is not really a horror film at all. It's really a film about a childhood and lost innocence. And this child is trying desperately to connect with not just her parents, but with her whole world. One of the best movies ever made about children. The title has nothing to do really with what the movie's about, these titles were pre-sold to distributors on the grounds that they would bring in audiences because the way the title was set up. But that's not the case. But Curse of the Cat People was directed by Robert Wise, who went on to become a major director. He directed one of the best Val Lewton movies, which was The Body Snatcher, starring Boris Karloff and with Henry Daniell and Bela Lugosi. This was based on a Robert Louis Stevenson short story, and it's very moody, and it was based on a true historical situation. There were these two grave robbers in Edinburgh, Scotland, back in the 19th century, who would dig up recently buried bodies and sell them to a local hospital, to the university, for doctors to do research on them. But when they ran out of recent deaths, they started making their own. In other words, they started killing people and then selling the, pardon the expression, fresh bodies to the medical clinic. And that's presided over by Henry Daniell. And also in the cast is Bela Lugosi, who has a short but memorable part. And it's set in period. And again, it was based on the Robert Louis Stevenson short story, which is based in turn on the historical situation that finally these two were found out. And even the doctor to whom they were selling the cadavers was implicated. And Boris Karloff's performance in this film is one of the absolute best he ever gave, even allowing for his fame as the Frankenstein monster. But Robert Wise directed later horror film, The Haunting. He directed a science fiction classic, The Day the Earth Stood Still. But actually, he's most famous for making the first version of West Side Story, 1961 version. And also his most famous film, actually, most popular film, is The Sound of Music, winner of multiple Academy Awards. So these directors, professionals who worked with Val Lewton, were being schooled in just basic arts of cinema kind of questions. But to mention again, Boris Karloff, he appeared in 3 of these films, The Body Snatcher, we just mentioned, and he's very, very spooky in that. He's really blackmailing this doctor played by Henry Daniell, and he's a very grim figure. Again, these films have no violence to speak of, and certainly no blood and gore. Violence is very, very minimal, whatever there is of it, but they're all heavily atmospheric. And people have described Val Lewton's films as a land of shadows, and that certainly is accurate. There's several other films that were done here with Boris Karloff. One was called Isle of the Dead, and that was directed by Mark Robeson, who went on to have quite a career in the 1950s, made films with Paul Newman, From the Terrace and The Prize, and probably his most popular film was Peyton Place, later on in the 1950s. And Isle of the Dead is set in an island off of Greece, where there is, again, these fearful spirits are present. The centerpiece of the film is a woman who's an epileptic and lives in fear of being buried alive, a classic Edgar Allan Poe kind of device. And there is a harrowing scene, brilliantly put together, where this woman has died, and we, the audience, know she's not really dead. She's simply had an epileptic fit, but people didn't pick up on that. And she's inside of a coffin in a crypt that's above ground, but she's in this crypt. And so in this one scene, the camera is just focusing on the coffin that's in the crypt, and we hear sounds which we recognize as this poor woman is waking up, and then she's like feeling her surroundings, and she realizes then that she is in a coffin, that she's in fact been buried alive, and she lets out this piercing shriek. It is a very scary scene. You don't even see a person. You just hear the sound effects. But that's how effective that Val Lewton could be. Another key director that he worked with was Jacques Tourneur, who directed Cat People, also a film with another kind of wild title, I Walked with a Zombie. Jacques Tourneur was able to convey just spiritual truths he did one of the best films ever about a Christian pastor called Stars in My Crown. And he has in this film a strong sense of voodoo. I Walk with I want to talk about I Walk with a Zombie. There's that, it's set in the Caribbean, in off an island, and with a voodoo, essentially in Haiti. And again, it's very kind of spooky and very kind of strange. And Tourneur does a great job with that. So that, and it actually has some similarities with Jane Eyre. There's this young woman who comes into this household unaware of what her employer is really all about, and he's a tragic figure, and he's got this wife who's considered to be crazy. All these things are very reminiscent of Jane Eyre, which was actually filmed around the same time with Orson Welles in the cast, and even though he doesn't get the directorial credit for it, it looks like Welles definitely directed part of that film. So these films are piling up on top of each other, whether it's The Wolfman or Jane Eyre or whatever. They're all kind of coming together, but Val Lewton is playing a critical role. And again, he's the producer. So he's setting these things up. He's really teaching film artistry in the same context that he's doing films that are supposed to be commercially profitable because they're paid, set for a horror audience, but they're far more complex. As I've indicated, they're not conventional. There isn't. He at one point was either he or Robert Wise made some comment about in the Universal horror films, basically a woman is chased up a tree by a werewolf, and that's kind of the upshot of it. So that's a little too critical, a little too negative. But the fact remains that Val Lewton achieved a huge amount of effect with very little substance, with just suggestions. And this idea, we mentioned this last time, we were talking about how I came to be involved with horror films, interested in them. He had this device which was called the bus. And I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. And it was a sequence, this is from Cat People, in which a woman is walking alone at night in Central Park, of all places. And she thinks something is following her. And then all of a sudden, unexpectedly, we hear this big whoosh. And it's the opening of a bus, door of a bus, initially she jumps, we jump when we first hear this, and then she gets on the bus and she's in apparent safety. But film after film, he has something like that, where all of a sudden something outside the frame of the film gives you this noise and kind of has you stand up and sort of like, what's happening? Who did that? Who's there? And very much this theme of who's there is vital to the Val Lewton films. There's something out there following us, something out there stalking us, and we don't really know what it is. There's a film called The Leopard Man he did, where you feature this Black Panther again, who appeared in Cat People. The resident part of the acting troupe is this Black Panther. And that film also deals with this idea of being stalked, in this case, stalked by the leopard. It's actually a black leopard. And there's a very shocking scene in that film where a young child has been disobedient, and his mother's given her, I think, a hard time, and she's outside, and then all of a sudden she's being followed by the leopard, and she rushes to the house, and we don't see her. We see the mother, who thinks that she's trying just to get attention. And she's banging on the door saying, let me in, let me in. And the mother is saying, no, you've got to go to this, whatever, go to the store, complete your errands. I've had enough of your nonsense. And then the next thing you know, we have a scene of the door, and blood starts flowing under the door. Again, we never see the little girl. We never see an attack, but it's very, very haunting and very disturbing that this takes place. Another film that is very notable, and another director, I mentioned the director Mark Robeson, I mentioned who did Island of the Dead, did a film called Bedlam about the notorious insane asylum in the 18th century, where people who were judged to be insane were just, in effect, locked away. There's no serious treatment or whatever. And Boris Karloff plays the head of this asylum, and he's very corrupt, and eventually needless to say, the inmates get their revenge on him. But again, it's all very, very moodily done. And there's a woman who's the whole rest part of the film. And again, this is spoiler alerts. Who just stands against the wall with a kind of a blank expression in much of the film. And at the very end, when Karloff is trying to back away from the inmates who are trying to get their just revenge, she has taken a trowel, they used to cover to work in a garden, and she holds this thing up, and he's backing up toward her. He thinks she just doesn't respond; she's not mobile, but he gets too close, and she stabs him in the back with this shovel thing, this trowel, and that basically is going to do him in. The inmates decide the best way they can cover up his death, because they'll be blamed for it, is to wall up a section of their surroundings, their big room that they live in, wall it up and place him inside that wall, and nobody will ever find the body or know anything ever happened to him. So that they do this, but just as they're about to put the last brick in, Karloff's slumped over there. They think he's dead. We think he's dead, but all of a sudden, he opens his eyes, his head lifts up, and the last brick goes in, and he's again buried alive. Another kind of frightening, really theme. So these films show that imagination is by far the most important element in these kind of films. That you have to imagine things, and again, it's the things that we can imagine ourselves are far more frightening than what somebody else can scare us with by some other kind of thing they're acting out. You can have all the werewolves and mummies and zombies and so forth as you want, but they're not really, none of them are as frightening as our idea of what those figures might be like. Well, we're moving along here. I want to mention what I think, though, is the best film that Val Lewton did in this series, and it's not really the most famous, but I think it's just outstanding. And again, plays into my my role as a retired minister. It's a film called The Seventh Victim, and it's about a devil cult in Greenwich Village, of all places. And this woman gets caught up in this devil cult and then tries to break away from it. But the believers in the cult take the position that if you ever try to leave the cult, you're betraying it, and then you have to be killed. And so she is the seventh victim in this bizarre kind of commitment that if you try to leave the cult, the members will come after you and will kill you. So the film opens with her sister starting to look for her because she is missing. And she's also kind of like, in effect, in hiding. So that's going on. There's also a scene in the film here, and the sister is played by Kim Hunter, who is a fairly well-known associate actress. And there is a scene that looks like it's an inspiration for Psycho, where this woman's in a shower, and it's actually an older woman comes in and confronts her through the shower curtain. Now, she's not going to try to kill her. She doesn't have a weapon, but it sets up this picture, which definitely reminds us of Psycho, of where the woman is very vulnerable. She's in the shower, and some dark figure all of a sudden comes unexpectedly and terrorizes her. And so one can look at that and say, yeah, well, Hitchcock must have seen that somewhere along the line, and it must have been an inspiration for Psycho. So again, the influence of Val Lewton casts a large shadow on all kinds of people. Go back to The Seventh Victim. There's all kinds of these stalking parts. And the other thing is they're trying, what the cult wants to convey, what they threaten people with, is they want them to commit suicide, which gets them out of the way easily. And then that avoids the necessity of actually committing murder, which could lead to other problems. So that's being set up here. And this poor woman keeps hiding. And what eventually happens, she's in an apartment building with this other woman who shows up in Val Lewton's films, a woman named Jane Randolph. And there's a scene of the two of them where this Jane Randolph has been sick, and she's been, her character and she's been laid up in her apartment, hasn't gone out, and she has a talk with this the woman who's the victim, whose name is Jacqueline, played by Jean Brooks, and they have this exchange, and Jacqueline even seems to say, well, you should to this other character who's been depressed and sick, go out and try to have a good time. And so she's going to agree to do that. But what happens at the very end of the film, and in a number of these films, Val Lewton quotes from John Donne, of all things. But John Donne's most favorite poem is "Death Be Not Proud." So that in itself is a challenging part about death. At the end of The Seventh Victim, though, Jane Randolph character is going out. We see that we don't see her in the apartment, but she comes out of the apartment in the hallway. There's a staircase, and she's about to go out. And she's dressed up, and she's going to, quote, have some fun, have some life to her. But as she is walking down the steps, we hear another sound from Jacqueline's apartment, and we realize what it's done is that she had a noose set up there with a stool, and she's kicked over the stool and she's hanged herself. Again, we don't see any of that. We just hear it, but we realize what's going on. One of the most effective scenes in this film, which I think is it's hard to pick one of all the Val Lewton ones as being the best or a classic of some kind. It all works together well. But there's a great scene where this friend who's played by Tom Conway is in a number of these films. He was kind of an aristocratic British figure. And he and another friend have traced this Jacqueline to the Devil's Cove, Devil's group that's meeting there in Greenwich Village. He confronts them with how pathetic they are. And their response to him is, "We didn't ask your opinion." And he, in effect, says, "Well, I'll give it to you anyway." And what he does is he quotes from the Lord's Prayer. "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And as he's quoting it, you have this group of, they look like perfectly normal people, even though they're part of a witchcraft coven. As he's quoting this line from the Lord's Prayer, we see the expression on their faces, and they all look down, look away. You can see it's nobody is screaming or trying to run away or anything like that. But what we do see is they're very troubled by what they're hearing, and they turn away, they look away. And that kind of sets up the idea here that these devil worshippers do not have any real power. They only have the power that someone gives to them. And the tragedy here is that this victim, the seventh victim of the title, that Jacqueline takes the challenge of committing suicide, which is what they want her to do. But the point that's being made in the film is she doesn't have to do that. And these devil worshippers don't have the power to make her do that. And we end up with another quote from John Donne. It's just a fascinating film, as are most of Val Lewton's pictures. Let me sort of wrap that up. I would just say that one good thing is that these films are very available now. There's 9 of them. And another one we didn't mention is Ghost Ship. You can think of that as a haunted ship. But again, what makes these films so effective is their sense of mood and the sense of setting. And you really don't see a whole lot of anything in terms of the supernatural, much less any kind of violence. What you do see, or actually better, what you hear, is what's going on, like a woman being buried alive or the woman committing suicide. You hear these things, and you imagine them in your own mind, your own imagination. And it's far more disturbing than if you saw anything. Looking back from the hindsight of some 80 years, we've had all kinds of splatter movies over the course of time, lots of violence and lots of bloodshed. And there aren't that many filmmakers, producers, or directors who can match Val Lewton with this idea that what you don't see is more frightening than what you do see. So this is Paul. I'm signing off for 10 Times the Terror. See you next time.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror,
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that one again. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.